he won the election 1.3 million votes to 0 because there was no one else. And like that was reported as like, look at how popular I am.
Y'all, we're the good doctors of Abbey Research. I am Dr. Kristen.
I'm Dr. Erin.
You are very welcome to our corner of the internet for this edition of our series, The Colonizer's World Tour, where we, two exceptionally white girls, spend a week or a month, depending, in a country around the world examining its legacy of colonization. Sometimes we take whole months and park in a country when we know we need to look at it more in depth. Haiti is one such country, so we're on week 3 of our conversation about Haiti, and no conversation about Haiti is complete without talking about Papadoc. We've got to talk about the Duvaliers, both Papa and Baby Doc, and so we're going to do that today. Usually, weeks are 2 separate videos. We talk about the thing, and then we talk about art. The thing with Papadoc is that, like, we don't have a biopic or anything about him, so everything is, like, really documentary, History Channel episode styles, or like a really good podcast I listened to. So we're just going to combine them both, tell you everything you need to know about Papadoc and his legacy, not only in Haiti, but in Haiti's relationship with the world. So this is just one video, might be a little longer than normal because of the fact that we're combining. But before we get started, I've been a little bit of a nerd for Haiti for a long time, and so I knew a little bit about Papadoc. I've also studied dictators because I'm, again, just a little bit of a nerd. But Dr. Erin, my dear one, what did you know about Papadoc before we started talking about Haiti?
It sounded vaguely familiar, and I couldn't realize, I couldn't remember why I would have learned about him. Right. But it must have come up in like a history class or something. I don't know. Very, very little. Yeah, the name sounded familiar was literally it. I wasn't even sure at the time if I could have told you that he had anything to do with Haiti. So yeah, I had a lot to learn about this dude.
All right, well then let's get into it.
Yeah.
So really brief biographical sketch here. Papadoc is a Black Haitian that is incredibly important. Francois De Valier was born in 1907. Which again is a very auspicious time in Haiti's history. He came of age during the American occupation, and went to medical school. Actually, in America, he has a graduate medical degree from the University of Michigan. And when he came back to Haiti, he took that medical knowledge, and at this point, there's no evidence outward that he's a sociopath, but he may have been one. You know, we don't have a psychological evaluation on Papadoc here. He died in 1971. But when he got back to Haiti after the University of Michigan, he literally walked the island and gave out penicillin to cure a disease that is pretty much just affects people in poverty called yours. And with the penicillin, he gave it out. Haitian people had never seen anything like this before. So not only did he build trust that he was somebody who could heal them, but in the voodoo tradition, he very quickly became somebody that they could almost think of as a spirit or a deity or something of that fashion, because medicine wasn't something that the illiterate population of Haiti had any relationship with until he walked into their village, gave them a pill, cured them of this thing. If you've grown up believing in voodoo, I cannot imagine how that wouldn't fit into your existing spirituality.
Yeah, and like the idea of a healer was so much more potent than what any understanding of medicine was.
Yeah.
And so the two became conflated very easily, and then he also added to that conflation by presenting himself that way.
So then in 1957, he runs for president and wins. And he is president until 1971. There's a lot of incarnations of his presidency throughout this time. There were some things that, a casual observer could call an election. But, he was the only one on the ballot. Most of the country was still illiterate. It's all really hard stuff. And then he was immediately preceded by his son. Mm-hmm. And so the Duvalier dictatorship and its effects really overtook Haiti, you can argue, from 1957 to 2000 when Aristide is elected. Because the people between Baby Doc and Aristide didn't exactly fix anything. So it's massive. It's a huge part. At one point, he tells everyone that Haiti elected him as president for life. He rewrote the Constitution. It was all very bad. But if you read his chronology, it's a very almost methodical descent into abusive madness. He starts off by healing the Haitian people. There's no evidence in any of his journals or his talks that he did this so that he could control the Haitian people. He was super anti-imperialist, really wanted Haiti to be its own people. But he's always been one thing we do know from his beginning is that he has always been very pro-black folks and very anti any other race. Mm-hmm. When he was in Michigan, he told a classmate, this was quoted on the Real Dictators podcast, that the Marines were chosen specifically from the South to be as racist as possible and were children of the devil. The Marines that occupied Haiti. Now, we know that the Marines that did occupy Haiti were predominantly from the South. There is evidence that they were chosen that way, but he already knew this, assumed this, believed this, was kind of going out there. So that kind of sets him up. He really, really wanted to be a champion for the black people, which honestly no other politician ever had been since independence. Not a single one. So he kind of champions and he wins power really quickly.
Yeah. And so, Dr. Kristen mentioned the podcast that you can listen to if you'd like to learn more as well. But what we watched together to help my education, Dr. Kristen had already watched it, but to help me have this conversation, was an episode of The Evolution of Evil, which is on Prime Video. Slip of the tongue. It's on Prime Video. I think, judging by its production level, it was probably first on the History Channel.
It feels History Channel.
It feels super Lifetime.
Yeah.
The narration.
And the dramatic swelling of the music and the reenactments were so bad.
Oh my God. I just kept thinking, who is this guy who, now has on his IMDb profile that he was Papadoc in the episode of The Evolution of Evil. So it is from season 1, episode 7 of The Evolution of Evil, and the episode is called Papadoc, Haiti's President for Life. So it's about 45 minutes that details really all of the stuff Dr. Kristen just broke down. It's very accessible. It's a little bit ridiculous with the narration and the reenactments.
But you'll know all this.
Yeah. But I think it really helps you get the vibe for who he was. It specifically goes into the fact that he was 8 when the Americans' occupation started. And, the occupation was very violent and racist and harsh. And so that's not going to help a person with a baby brain that's not anywhere near cooked to understand relationships with white people, or even mulattoes, who were at the time the people most in power in Haiti prior to the occupation. But really got him started for his big hate on the U.S. It talks about how he got interested in voodoo, which eventually becomes a big part of his dictatorship. Mm-hmm. And then it starts to really, really get into the politics of it. And the reason we wanted to have this discussion this week, Dr. Kristen's right. She said, you can't talk about Haiti without talking about Papadoc. But as we were talking about the first 2 weeks of this month, the impact of colonization on Haiti and the colonial legacy. You know, one of the colonial legacies of Haiti is political instability.
Yep.
And so you can trace it back to the fact that, you know, Haiti was the first Black republic, declared independence in 1791 in the early 1800s after a rebellion started in the 1790s.
Yeah, 1804, I think, was the official.
Yeah. So they declared themselves a republic, an independent republic in 1804, which, for those of you maybe just watching this video, well before the abolition of slavery in the United States, and even a good 2 decades before the abolition of slavery, full slavery in the United Kingdom. I want to say the abolition of slavery in the United Kingdom started in like 1809.
I don't remember when
1807. 1807.
Okay.
I have a coin. I have a commemorative coin with the dates on it. I think it was around. So, like, you know, abolition was being talked about, but it was still, certainly in the Western Hemisphere, a very threatening thing. And so
we should also say that the independence of Haiti, the Republic of Haiti, was not actually like this a full slave rebellion the way the rest of the world thought it was. Because the mulatto generals who ended up being in charge at the end still wanted to keep slaves and the plantation system. They just wanted mulattoes to have power alongside whites.
Yeah, and so it becomes this kind of existential threat to white folks in power in the Western Hemisphere. And internally, it just replicates the system and structures of oppression that existed prior to emancipation and prior to the revolution. And so they kind of just adopt those systems of political oppression. If you want to learn, one thing you need to know about Haiti's politics is there's been like 50 coups or something since it was formed. So they don't know how to maintain power. They don't know how to keep power. Lots of military coups. One of the things they tell you in this episode is that out of the 22 heads of state from 1883 to 1915, first of all, that's a lot of heads of state in that 40-year period. Only 2 finished their full term. Only 2. Until you get to Papadoc. So it is this legacy of colonialism that creates this political instability and a void that then is filled by lots of people who want to take power and keep it, but certainly Papadoc being the big one of it. So I think he's a direct lineage to the impact of colonization, and kind of an encapsulation of all of the political turmoil that came out of that. Both colonization and, you know, emancipation and independence. So it's a fascinating, like, tiny little case study to then pull all these threads out of.
Also, we talk a lot about, like, why is Haiti still so screwed now? And why are the Haitian people so screwed? And, you know, there's... I read in a book, like, beware of anyone who tells you there's one answer. And, you know, we know from our study of Northern Ireland, there's always at least 5 sides to a story. Mm-hmm. So I was really gratified as we did this deep dive to really understand that, like, yes, colonization, super bad. The French's absolute refusal to forgive the debt and, in fact, charge them extra debt, which no other colonizing power did to this extent, terrible. But a lot of the authors and the analysis and the academics that I've read, they're like, if you, as a Haitian person, only blame the French and the Americans for your problems, you're missing a massive piece.
You're missing a trick, yeah.
Which is that your own countrymen who seek power for their own good, and not for the good of the Haitian people. The original, maybe that was different, was Papadoc's first term. People say that in the first term, he did try to do some things. He comes into it as Minister of Health. His time doing yaws, the Yurs treatment, he was possibly the very first politician to leave Port-au-Prince in about 100 years. So he was the first one to, like, hear the villages. This is also where the badness probably started in his brain, because he began to realize exactly how illiterate everybody was, and exactly how superstitious they were, and exactly what voodoo was.
And he had been studying it since, like, university as well.
Yeah. As
so
part of his noirism, which is this black, what noir is, black nationalist politics of Haiti.
Yeah. And so, you know, he was already a student of Voodoo, but then I think, yeah, you're right, like, both his impact as, or his experiences as a doctor, traveling doctor, and as the Minister of Health, I think probably started to sow the seeds of him realizing the advantageous power in capitalizing on the strength of Voodoo practices especially in rural areas.
For sure.
And socioeconomically deprived areas where people don't have access to understanding concepts outside of that spiritualism. So yeah, I mean, he eventually gets to a point where he decides that he is the incarnation of a Voodoo Loi.
Yep.
Baron Samedi, who is the guard of the graveyard, and starts to tell people that that's what he is. And it works. It
totally works.
People are super scared.
As you can imagine, in a country with as much political instability and military coups as Haiti, paranoia is rife because you're always looking over your shoulder for somebody who's going to, you know, whatever. But the first person who seemed to really understand that was Papadoc, because in 1957 he gets elected and he exiles, like, the entire military. And it pretty much, like,
anyone who disagrees with him,
he's gone. So he starts drawing lines in the sand really quickly. Are you for him or are you against him? And history tells us that at the beginning of any time that this kind of happens, people are skeptical, like, it's actually real. Because it's so against most human nature to, like, draw strong lines like that, like, there's a little bit of, like, oh, he can't be serious. Like, oh, like, he'll be fine. So then there's a couple attempted coups. None of them go well. He turns his personal bodyguards into the country's boogeymen, where they are just going everywhere. So by the time you hit 1961 and he's up for re-election, he wins in a landslide. There is no actual, like, everyone might acknowledge the election internationally, but, like, I think the New York Times said something like, if you want an example of an absolutely corrupt election, check out Haiti. Like, y'all need to see what's happening in Haiti in 1961. It's bad.
There was no one else on the ballot.
And there was, like, more votes cast than Haitian citizens.
He won the election 1.3 million votes to 0 because there was no one else. And, like, that was reported as, like, look at how popular I am.
So he decides at this point that, you know, a couple of both the documentaries, they tell that if you thought the first term was bad, welcome to the second term. The rule of law is completely dead. He ignores the Constitution. He installs a torture chamber in the presidential palace so that he can watch the torture of his enemies. He includes violent voodoo populism. Things are bad. People are escaping, seeking asylum in the U.S., and this puts him on the radar of JFK. And we have to talk about this. So if we were doing Jeopardy fun facts, this would be mine for this episode.
Yeah.
Which is that we were evidently, as the U.S., super close to getting rid of Papadoc. Like, things were, like, we were building a case. We were going to send people in. We were going to overthrow him.
JFK was, like, not down with it at all.
No, JFK was, like, super not into it. It didn't matter that, like, we had Castro to worry about, which is, you know, a whole other thing with the Red Scare, of which I am just constantly tired. But JFK was like, he's torturing his people. And he's, like, 90 miles from our shores. Like, we're going to take care of this. Mm-hmm. But then, of course, you may be familiar, in November 22nd of 1963, John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr. is assassinated in the city of Dallas, Texas. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not the Jeopardy fun fact. The Jeopardy fun fact is that Papadoc tells the entire nation of Haiti that he is the reason JFK is dead. That he put a voodoo curse on him. Mm-hmm. That Papadoc himself is that powerful that he got the spirits to assassinate a sitting U.S. president. Yeah. So imagine the rest of the Duvalier's reign.
Like, who's... If you already believe that he is connected in that way to voodoo, if you already believe that he is the incarnation of Baron Samedi, why wouldn't you believe him?
And at that point, it's just petrification.
Scare the pants off of you.
Yep.
Yeah, and like one of the things that they made a good point in this episode that we watched was that he didn't he didn't use voodoo to control the nation, but he used the belief in and the fear of voodoo to keep himself in power.
Yeah.
And I think that's like a really important distinction. If we were doing Jeopardy fun facts, which we are now because you just did one and I'm going to do one, I wasn't sure which one I was going to choose, and I'm still not because I'm like my eyes are bouncing back and forth on my notes. I'm going to choose two because they're both quick. One was right after JFK was assassinated. There was an attempt to overthrow Papadoc by some Haitian-born refugees who lived in the United States. A group called June, and they didn't succeed because Papadoc found out about them, and he put the decaying body of one of these June members in the arrivals hall at the airport in Port-au-Prince, so that people knew where they were arriving and what happened.
Like the decaying corpse tied to a chair.
We have the footage tied to a chair in the arrivals hall. And then the other one is that he had the Lord's Prayer rewritten to be about him.
That's another great one. That's a great one because in 1964 he wins another landslide election and then uses which is a constitutional referendum to give him perpetual control. He lets them all know that he is an immaterial being. So he is eternal. Even if he dies, he lives. Because there is a concept of this in voodoo. He will essentially become a zombie. And so don't bother assassinating me. Because I will still control.
I'm not going anywhere.
I will still be the most powerful thing. And so then this is when he starts setting up his son to take over, which Baby Doc does from 1971 to
15 years. So 86.
86 he is overthrown, and he was a whole other kind of issue. He just wasted an absolute ton of money. He didn't really
and
do this. He just wasted an absolute ton of money.
Yeah, and Baby Doc dies of a heart attack while awaiting trial for his crimes. So follows right after his papa on that one. Yeah, it's a crazy story. Like, it really is some of the most sensational stuff I've heard about a leader in a long time. And you and I have covered a lot of dictators in this Colonizers World Tour and a lot of crazy stories. Yeah. You know, it's not Chechnya.
No one, we're not, like, John Oliver didn't make a video about someone's cat.
Yeah. But
we're not setting up Bedouin tents in front of the White House, but like...
I think you're one from Chechnya, and Papadoc would have got on like a house on fire.
Really, really well.
Yeah. So he's not the first, nor will he be the last megalomaniacal dictator. Nope. But he certainly is a particular one, and one that, you know, if you understand that still his son was basically an extension of him and in power until the mid-'80s, you can understand there's no way Haiti has recovered from that level of instability. No. We've talked about dictatorships in other parts of the world more recently in some of our Colonizers World Tour. And, you know, places just don't recover that quickly from things that the 80s was a long time ago, but not that long ago. So it's really important to understand the context of really any of the other topics that we're covering about Haiti this month. You have to understand the impact of the Duvaliers on literally everything. Yeah.
You can't... I guess it's one of those, like, history keeps happening. Yeah. Like, there was... So the Marines came in 1915, built a bunch of infrastructure, which they didn't, as imperialists do, make sure that it could be maintained. They didn't actually ask what the people needed, and they just kind of built an infrastructure that then crumbled. and continued to crumble and continued to do nothing. So then you hit 2010 and there's no way to quickly move aid around the area. There's no way, there's no organization, there's nothing. And, you know, there's lots of comparisons drawn between the DR and Haiti and why the DR is like this thriving tourist destination and why Haiti, and like, just like the book I already said, anyone who gives you one answer is lying. It's all of these things. It's that it was started as this beacon of revolution that didn't actually want to change anything. And it continued to be built on oppression. And it continued to be built on power to the military. And it just kept doing that. And as we talk now, they're in the middle of another really unstable set of circumstances. And the Haitian people are caught as pawns between folks who want power and not leadership.
Yeah. Yeah. And it really is it's just damn depressing. This whole month, we just keep looking at each other going, oh, poor Haiti. Because it all adds up. Everything we've talked about all adds up. And what it adds up to is not great for the Haitian people, who are, in fact, people with hopes and dreams and goals beyond being used as political tools.
Absolutely.
And so, you know, as always, that's where our hearts and minds are with the ordinary folks just trying to find some sort of life out of this absolute clusterfuck of a 200-year history.
Yeah, and if this is the first time you're joining us, this is our reminder that if you have resources to share, one of the places we recommend you share your resources with is the nonprofit Partners in Health, which has been in Haiti since the 80s, really.
Early 80s, yeah.
And is doing incredible work that empowering indigenous medicine and healers and doctors, Haitian-trained doctors, in the midst of all of this instability. Partners in Health continues to be a consistent force. So if you have resources to share, the link will be in the downstairs, and they're the ones we recommend the highest.
That's right. And that, I think, is a wrap on our discussion of Papadoc for today and a little political analysis of Haiti. Next week, for our final edition this time of our conversation about Haiti. We're never gonna say we're 100% done. But for our final week this month about Haiti, we're going to be talking about the economy, which is, as you can imagine, has a lot to do with, you know, colonization, enslavement, plantations, and 200 years of political instability. So again, as always, nothing but sunshine and rainbows here at Abbey Research. But then again, if you're watching this, you're watching a video with the subtitle Colonizer's World Tour. So you're not necessarily here for sunshine and rainbows. If you are here for our coverage, and we hope that you are, please comment below with what you think. Share any resources that you have about Haiti or Papadoc that you would want to share. And do all of the YouTube-y things of liking and subscribing and hitting that bell so that you don't miss our next conversation. And we hope to see you then, either next in the playlist or next week, for our discussion of the Haitian economy.
Absolutely. We'll see you guys then. Bye.